I'm Dr. Suraiya Shahin, and today I will teach you Elizabethan poetry. What is Elizabethan poetry and what is the style of their writing and what are the characteristics of Elizabethan poetry? All these points are important in this lecture. I will do all these points in today's lecture. Let me talk about what is Elizabethan poetry. In the history of English literature, our early modern period begins with the Elizabethan period and its date is 1558 to 1603. Queen Elizabeth I accedes to throne in 1558 and that's why this period is called Elizabethan period. And Elizabethan poetry is written during the reign of Queen Elizabeth I. Okay, Elizabethan period is divided into age of Shakespeare and age of Spenser. The most famous Elizabethan poets are William Shakespeare, Philip Sidney, and Edmund Spenser. If I talk about the influence of the Elizabethan poets, they are basically influenced by classical literature and the Renaissance spirit. Clear? Now I talk about the style of their poetry. Elizabethan poetry is mostly written in blank verse, which is unrhymed iambic pentameter. This is very important. Keep in the mind. Elizabethan poetry is mostly written in blank verse, which is unrhymed iambic pentameter. Okay? Clear? Now I talk about characteristics of Elizabethan poetry. First is the sonnet. The key innovation of Elizabethan poetry is the English sonnet. Thomas White introduced the Italian sonnet to England, but Henry Howard, Earl of Surrey, revoked it into its typical English form. We find Elizabethan sonnets written in iambic pentameter. Elizabethan sonnets are written in iambic pentameter and the sonnet consists of 14 lines which are often divided into 3 quatrains. Remember it, the sonnet is written in 3 quatrains and usually it's in iambic pentameter. 14 lines are often and they were divided into 3 quatrains and 1 couplet. The rhyming scheme is A B A B C D C D E F E F G G. Clear? The first 8 lines are called octet and the final 6 lines are called sestet. The publication of Philip Sidney's Astrophel and Estella in 1591 created an equally extraordinary book for the sonnet sequence. Sidney's main imitators are Samuel Daniel, Michael Dryden, Greville, Spenser, and Shakespeare. Spenser is called the poet's poet by Charles Lamb. Spenser is called the poet's poet by Charles Lamb. Very important point. After Chaucer, Spenser is regarded as the second father of English poetry. He is mainly known for his Shepherd's Calendar, the 4 rhymes, Mother Husband's Tale, the Complaints, the Amrati, the Epithalamion, and the masterpiece that is the Fairy Queen. As we must know that sonnet for the first time was introduced by White and Surrey in the first half of the 16th century. Later on, we find that the great sonneteer Shakespeare, who is known for his writing 154 sonnets by bringing a slight alteration in the pattern. Most of the Elizabethan poets followed the Italian pattern of octave, and sestet. But Shakespeare changed a slight difference. Shakespeare changed a slight difference by breaking the sonnets into 3 quatrains joined by a couplet. Now I talk about the next characteristics of Elizabethan poetry, and the next is classical influence. Elizabethan poetry is marked by the influence of classical literature. They give allusions to classical mythology in their poetry. So it is like giving rebirth to classical matter in their poetry. They followed traditional pattern of blank verse in their poetry. The credit of bringing blank verse goes to the Earl of Surrey. Always keep in the mind, this is very important point. The credit of bringing blank verse goes to the Earl of Surrey, who used blank verse in his translation of the Aeneid. And what is the Aeneid? The Aeneid is an epic poem by Roman poet Virgil. So, in a way, the classical writers greatly influenced the Elizabethan poetry. The next characteristic is religious lyrics. Elizabethan poetry is laden with religious lyrics, which includes religious poetry, narrative poetry, epic poetry, and metaphysical poetry. Elizabethan poetry is marked by the narrative poetry, which signifies telling the stories through the medium of poems. Signifies telling the stories through the medium of poems, as we find this style in Sidney's Astrophel and Stella and Spenser's Shepherd's Calendar and the Fairy Queen. Elizabethan poets used religious concepts like prayer, worships, heavenly, and salvation to express their feelings for their beloved. Clear? Next characteristic is personal, subjective, and theme of love. One of the major characteristics of Elizabethan poetry is that they are personal and subjective in tone. Always keep in the mind that Elizabethan poetry is mostly personal and subjective in tone. For example, the sonnets of Shakespeare and Sidney mainly exhibit insights into personal lives and feelings of the poets. In their poetry, we find them narrating their own experience of love, longing, and heartbreak. Spenser's Ambrose celebrates usually fulfilled. Spenser's Ambrose celebrates unusually fulfilled sexual love achieved within marriage. Some of the Shakespeare sonnets also offer a different world altogether and having the tone personal. Shakespeare sonnets are lovely expression of an innocent heart where the lovers express the deep desire for their beloveds. Shakespeare sonnets are also expression of personal and intimate experiences. As we find that Sidney's sonnets, right? Sidney's sonnets are also expression of personal and intimate experiences, as his poem Astrophel and Stella is regarded as an autobiographical work and is inspired by the relationship with Penelope de Verux, who is presented as Stella in this work. Edmund Spenser's Ambrose is also personal, which is the collection of 89 sonnets, and Spenser wrote these sonnets for Elizabeth Boyle, whom he married. So Spenser has illustrated idealized and spiritualized love, often comparing the beloved to a goddess. Clear? Next and the last characteristic is courtly love. We find courtly love in Elizabethan poetry. In their poetry, we see the lover serving a beloved with devotion, similar to serving a deity or goddess, and which remains a common theme in courtly love poetry. Okay, so these are the characteristics of all Elizabethan poetry. Thanks for today.